All right, everybody. Well, let's get started. It's really nice to see you all again. Thank you for your flexibility and just kind of rolling last week. And we waited as long as we felt comfortable. And when we knew that a lot of people were still without power, we decided it would be the best call to cancel the session, knowing that you had other things to worry about. You might not have had access. So we appreciate your flexibility. We're really excited to pick back up tonight exactly where we left off. We're going to take a couple of minutes just to reorient since it has been a little bit longer. And I just wanted to let you know that we are working to figure out the best plan for sort of making up or folding in that session so that we don't lose. Since we only have 6 weeks in deep dive, there's really a lot of important content in each session. So we're picking up tonight with session 2, and we are making plans for how to complete the full course of our 6 sessions together. And Seth and I will be in touch with you as soon as we have a plan made on that. Seth, did you want to add anything?
No, I think what you said it. We're going to try to do what makes the most logical sense to support the coach group, but at the same time, then in connection to how does that play out with the teachers as well. So we'll get with you guys very soon on that plan, and it'll be something that makes sense for all of us. So at the same time, keeping our learning going. But we appreciate all of you guys, and that's it.
All right. Thanks, Seth. So one more little piece of business that might have gotten lost in the fray a little bit. On September 8th, which was right as you guys were entering the eye of the hurricane, I guess, you should have received your national peer review results for your task that was submitted after Blended Foundations. So hopefully you've had a chance to just take a peek at that and start to think about the feedback and how you might apply it. Today, each of you should have received an email from either Barb, Kimba, or me inviting you to a one-on-one session. And we're offering those really just to offer ourselves as thought partners as you process that feedback and decide your next directions for revising the task that will then allow you to also continue building your instructional ladder in a way that's really aligned to that task. Because as you know, that's going to be our focus here in Deep Dive 1. And then a couple of weeks after the close of this experience, you'll then resubmit your full module. That task will be reviewed again, and the instructional ladder will be reviewed for the first time as well. So just let us know if you have any questions about that process. But feel free to respond to whichever one of our team it was that reached out to you to get that meeting scheduled so that we can help you move forward with your task design. But for tonight, we are back to skills. So we are going to use our PLC time here in Deep Dive, as we talked about before, really for 2 simultaneous purposes. One, to support your own work in building a module and your own growth in the educator competencies, but also to continue to get increasingly metacognitive about facilitation moves and key course content that you can use in supporting teachers in your buildings or within your district. So increasingly, our discussions during the synchronous sessions are going to be about reflecting on how we can use some version of the activities that we're doing together in a context with other educators. And it will be more so in the asynchronous work that you're continuing to build your own skills through the coursework and develop your module. So just a heads up that the conversation is going to start to change. I think you'll really see that tonight in the discussion prompts as we do a little work in core tools, come back and reflect, do a little more work in core tools, come back and reflect. That reflection is really going to be oriented towards giving you an opportunity to think about how you could use these materials to facilitate with others. So we're going to begin tonight, right off the bat, we're going to jump into core tools. I don't even have slides to show you tonight, into instructional cycle 2, which you might recall from last week is the step in that spiral learning plan of the design assignments course that focuses really deeply on the skills list. And that's a good place for us to be right now in thinking about next steps with your module and in thinking about also bringing teachers through into the next instructional cycle where they will be designing another module. I'm going to walk you through how to get where we're going to do our work today and just model on my screen and then give you a moment to get there yourself. But if you're already ahead of me in core tools, we're going to be going to the design assignments course, to IC2, and to session 5. So I'm going to share my screen and model that pathway. And if you're ready, you can jump on ahead. So I've already got my Learn tab pulled up. We're going into design assignments, into IC2, which I'll click to expand. And tonight we're going to be working in session 5, which is called Analyze Skills List Alignment to Focus Standards. I'm going to give you a moment to get there. Megan has also posted the steps of that pathway in the chat. And once you're there, again, in session 5 of instructional cycle number 2, I'm going to ask you first tonight just to take a few minutes to read the very first card on this page. So I'm using the term card here, which we haven't really used before, but I just want to point out the way that the content is chunked within these sessions, because again, that might be useful to you as you're thinking about how to pull high leverage snippets to use with others and not necessarily going through every single step sequentially within a course. You can see that there are sections of text on basically a white rectangle, and behind that is a sort of a gray background. Each one of those is what we would call a card. That's just an easier way to refer to the different chunks of content in the course. So I'm going to ask you to take about 3 or 4 minutes to read the first card entitled Think and Practice. So we're starting here where it says backward design, and just read all the way through to the end of that card. You can skip the video, but I would encourage you as you get to the end of that card to click on the link that's on the very last phrase of the architecture of a skills list, just to refresh yourself and to know that that's there as a resource, because while you did do a little bit of work asynchronously with skills during blended foundations, we never really took the time to slow down and talk about that basic structure of the skills list that is common to all LDC modules. And that's where that link takes you. It's a kind of a handy short reference guide to that common structure of an LDC skills list. So once you read through this short section and get to the end of it, I will ask you to click on that just so you can see what's there and think about how that might be useful to you. After you read this section, again, as I noted before, we're actually going to pull back and reflect a little bit about what is really key in here if you were introducing this content to others. So we'll post specific discussion questions in a few minutes, but for now, just take about 3 minutes to read quietly through this Think and Practice session about backwards design. So as you get to the end of that section about backwards design and skills lists, I want you to post in the chat a little reflection. Imagine if you wanted to use this section as content with teachers in a PLC. What key line or snippet of this section would you want to highlight and focus on if you were facilitating with teachers? So take a moment to think and then post in the chat, what key line or snippet from this section that we just read would you highlight or focus on in facilitating this content with teachers? And in addition to that, you can see that Megan has posted this prompt in the chat. Are there any follow-up or maybe some guiding questions that you might pose to a teacher to support them in reading and taking away an understanding from this section? All right, we're seeing some great insights in the chat, and keep them coming if you haven't posted yet. But I think we're seeing a couple of common threads, right? One is that this really is about backwards design. So whatever you call things, whether using LDC terminology or not, it's really about beginning with the end in mind and using that for planning. And that's really why we started in our last session with doing the task and thinking about what the student results would actually look like and how you can use that to inform your planning around skills. This week, we're really building on that work to go even deeper in thinking about alignment of skills to the task prompt as well as the focus standards, and that's where we're going next. But I just want to point out that when we're thinking about alignment of skills, what we really are talking about is a module author being very explicit about the demands they're making of students through the task prompt so that they can design the instructional plans that will build student skills to the point that they can eventually meet those demands independently and with competency. So it's about building those enduring skills we're teaching the skills through the module. We're going to build in mini tasks, but the ultimate goal is for students to be able to use and apply those skills independently without as much support from us, right? And that's why this step is built in to the LDC design process, because you'll notice it doesn't fit neatly into one of these three boxes on my screen in that Wiggins and McTighe graphic. In a way, it's between steps 2 and 3 that we think about skills, so that we don't just jump to the learning experiences and instruction that will support students in completing this task, but we stop in between to think about what enduring skills they're building by responding to this task, and how our daily instruction can support that long-term growth of skills in addition to completion of this particular assignment. So those are the things that we really want to focus on when we think about alignment of a skills list to a task prompt and to standards. But it's also really important, as many of you pointed out in the chat, that we can't teach every single skill in every single module, right? There's a whole world of wonderful and worthwhile skills to teach, but we have to make strategic choices about what skills to address explicitly within the course of a module to get the most bang for our buck. So we are going to now move on to the next section in this session 5 and really look at some test cases together to see some exemplars of skills lists that have been customized a little bit from the default to really address some of the specific demands of their task and its focus standards. And this is going to enable you to then go on after tonight's session and apply a similar process to your own module, where you sit down with your partner and really do the work in the action item of this course to make sure that your skills list really does represent the key demands of your task prompt and of your focus standards. So this activity, which I'm showing on my screen right now, where it says do now, examine alignment in a skills list, it can get a little hairy. So I want you to take a moment to come out of any other windows that you might be in, and rather than looking at your own browser, come back here into Zoom just for a moment if you're not already here, so that I can really demonstrate for you exactly how to walk through this next process. So if you're not looking at my shared screen, go ahead and come back now so I can model this for you. We're going to look at one example all together. That's going to be this first one, elementary ELA. And then you're going to have time with your design partner, or with an alternate partner if your design partner is not here tonight, to apply the same process to a second module. So I'm going to begin by opening up this first box to expand the elementary literature example. This section of the course uses a lot of these, what we call show hide boxes, where you can kind of pop them open or condense them. So just be aware, we're going to be doing a little bit of that opening and closing of these show hide boxes. This is where you'll find the key steps of the next activity. So we're going to open up a module. In this case, it is an elementary ELA module called Comparing Characters' Responses to Events. And that's actually going to open in a separate tab. While that opens, I want to revisit the instructions that come next. So you're going to read through the task prompt and the focus cluster. And then you're going to look at the skills list, just the skills. The instructions actually been taken out in these examples so that you're only focusing on the skills. And think about how the demands of the task and of the focus standards are reflected in the skills that have been identified for the instructional ladder. Ask the question of whether we can see those key demands of the task represented in the skills, and how those skills will help support the student in accomplishing the final task. We're also going to just notice a little bit the different steps of thinking of the skill clusters. That's the preparing for the task section, the reading process section, transition to writing, and writing process. And within each section, think about how each skill really connects to the task prompt or focus cluster. So again, I'm going to quickly walk through a condensed version of that process just to model, and then you'll have some time to work on your own with your partner. So I'm going to click back to the tab where the module opened up, Comparing Characters' Responses to Events, and just take a little bit of time to process what I see here. So we are looking at, this is grade 2, this is ELA, it's about literature, so I'm scrolling down and noticing there's several focus standards identified. And the task prompt says, why do characters respond differently to events and challenges in a story? After reading and examining illustrations from Grandpa's Corner Store, write an essay in which you compare Stephen and Lucy's reactions to the new supermarket being built and explain why you think they reacted differently. Support your response with evidence from the text. So I notice next that the focus standards, I can see elements of these in the task. We've got RL 2.6, which is about looking at differences in points of view of characters. We've got RL 2.3, describe how characters in a story respond to major events and challenges. So those two are really coming together in this task. They're kind of integrating with one another in the call for students to compare two different characters' responses to the same events. So inherently, they're going to have to consider the differences in points of view of those two characters to understand why they have had different responses to a major event. If you're not familiar with this text, you can kind of glean this from context, but the idea is that Stephen and Lucy are kids whose grandfather owns a corner store and a big supermarket is opening in town. So of course, this is going to have a big effect on the family. So now that I know a little bit about what this task is asking for, I'm going to scroll down to the skills list and just see what I notice about how the skills list aligns to the demands of that task prompt and its focus standards. So I'm going to open up the question to you to discuss, either verbally or in the chat, what do you see here in the skills list that reflects the specific demands of this task and its focus standards?
I see that there is something from each skill cluster.
Okay, so you're seeing a balance of skills across those 4 different sections.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. What else do you all notice?
Seems like in the reading process would be mainly where we see the skills within the reading standards in particular reflected.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're preparing for the task, transition to writing, and then of course in the writing process we begin a little bit of the writing standard. But the reading standard in particular, I can see in those skill sets within the reading process.
And piggyback off of Seth, when you look specifically at the instructional build within the reading process, we often ask kids to infer first because, and specifically even at the very end, to cite my text evidence that they're able to, with using the pictures, relate to important character information. And by doing that, we can get into comparing and being able to go deeper within the characterization and the two characters. But you've got to start, and that's a scaffold. So just something else that I noticed.
Absolutely. So I'm sure there are many other insights that could emerge. We had a comment from Tabitha in the chat as well, noticing that some of the skills are kind of generic in the sense that they would be important for almost any task. And so you want to have some, not every single skill has to be totally customized because they're going to be transferable across many different tasks. But some, particularly in the reading process, as Seth noted, are really quite specific to this task, where it kind of guides how students are encountering the text. And then Megan noticed that there's also kind of a building and a progression of those skills to lead them in a logical sequence through the reading work that they need to do to respond to the task. So lots of really great insights there. Once you've had this kind of discussion with your partner and just kind of independently noticing what you notice about how the skills support the task prompt, what you can do is come back to the course page. And again, I'm sharing my screen to show you this. And you can see for each of the skills in that list, we actually have like a little pop-up think aloud that just expresses some noticings about that skill and how it supports the task. This is really just kind of an opportunity to build on your own thinking, almost to have a chance to engage in a conversation with the course about what you noticed versus what somebody else noticed. And it's just meant to give you a touch point to come back to your discussion that you had with your partner and kind of build from there. So for example, A couple of you pointed out the more custom skills in the reading process around inferences from illustrations and comparing. You'll notice if you open the think alouds for those that there are very similar observations here, right? The task prompt says, don't just read, but think about the illustrations as well. So here's a skill that supports that specifically so that students are then better prepared for the next skill of comparing. They've had a chance to first identify important information about each character separately, and now they're actually doing some comparison and contrast. And that comparison is both an enduring skill and something that's really specifically called for by those focus standards around different perspectives or points of view in the story. So as you go through this activity with your partner, you're going to follow the same process we just did. You're going to look together, you're going to scroll past this one that we just did all as a group, and you'll find that there's another example from middle school social studies called 3 Religions, 1 Sacred Place. And you're going to follow the same process. You're going to open that up, think about it together in a private chat, answer some of these questions. What do you notice about how the skills support the task and how they're structured? And then you can come back and open some of these show hides to just kind of get a comparison for what you noticed versus what somebody else noticed. So for this activity, you'll be working with your design partner unless they're unavailable tonight. And Heather has made a couple of partner adjustments based on that. So I'm going to put those in the chat right now. So if your usual design partner is not here, check out the chat, and we've given you an alternate partner. And Megan also put a note about how to start a private chat. So each of you should be opening the middle school social studies example, 3 Religions, 1 Sacred Place, and following these instructions, steps 1, 2, 3, 4, in the course block. As you discuss this skills list with your partner, I'm posting in the chat a couple of more specific questions to reflect on for this skills list in particular. If you have come back in Core Tools to look at the think alouds for this particular example, you'll notice that there's actually one at the top of the reading process that addresses kind of the unique structure of this reading process as a whole, in addition to the think alouds for each individual skill. So you might want to take note of that and see what is mentioned here about the sort of unique recursive style of this particular skills list, and then think for another minute or two in the chat with your partner about these questions of, you know, what's unique about this structure, what could be the benefits or drawbacks of this approach, and whether this is a structure that could be useful to you in your own work. All right, hopefully you've had a chance now to chat with your partner about what you notice in this skills list and its alignment and structure and how it supports the task that it is paired with. So now I want to come back together, and I'm not sharing my screen. I've got Zoom open in gallery mode because we've been engaging in kind of quiet mode for a while now. You've been in the chat, you've been thinking quietly, and I really want to come back as a group and open up the conversation a little bit so you can unmute and really jump in verbally to get to that metacognitive place that we mentioned earlier in the session. So stepping back from a moment about what you noticed about this particular skills list, let's think about this activity and this section of course content and think about how you might use this with teachers. And also, as you think about that, how might doing this kind of work be different if you were doing it in a face-to-face PLC? Because we have certain structures that we have to rely on here in Zoom as a virtual PLC, but it's always going to look a little bit different when you're facilitating something live. So I'm going to ask Megan to post those questions in the chat and invite all of you to just go ahead and unmute and jump right in to think about any of these 3 questions. How might you use this with teachers? What are some of the facilitation moves that are necessary here? And what might be different in a face-to-face PLC?
I feel like I want to be completely transparent here. This is the hardest part for me. I still feel very confused about what I'm looking at, about what skills I'm trying to accomplish. I'm reading the list and they seem so, lack of words, generic to me. I don't know if we're supposed to be specified on ours, and we're at an elementary level. I'm just, this is, I read it and I tried to converse, but I struggled in this part a lot.
Beth, are you thinking about struggling and engaging in the activity as part of the virtual PLC, or really in thinking about that skills list and the questions about alignment and customizing?
That skills list, where does that come in? How do we, when we were learning at that the 3-day institute as well, and we were trying to put some skills in, that is just where I kind of lost everything on where we were going with this. It got too much. Yeah, I don't know.
Can I jump in and say, like, here's a for example.
He's my for example.
Here's a for example for you. I'm going to use some evidence here. In the preparing for the tasks cluster, the task engagement, if that is a skill, it says the ability to connect the task and new content to existing knowledge. I guess for me, in reading what we read prior to doing this, I'm thinking that these are things that I'm going to have to teach. I don't know that this is, and I could be wrong, but I don't know that this is like, I think that this is something that kids have to be able to, I don't know that that's worth teaching. Does that make sense? Like, I think that that's something they just innately do. Is that, Beth? Is that where we're trying to go with that?
Yeah, I guess
like
I could see skills are more what do we need to teach? And you're right. Yes, Jen. Like, I guess I'm gonna dissect that prompt with them. I'm going to make sure they understand, but is that really a skill that I'm doing? I do that with them all the time in all subjects. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's hear from the group. Any other thoughts or responses to that?
I like what you guys are saying. I understand, but to me, this looks a lot like, I don't know if anybody's taken Project Chris, but the way that that's sorted out really gets you like looking at the whole lesson plan and what you're planning beforehand, what the kids are actually doing. So it's a little more in depth. And so while I was looking at like number 3, identify and explain how each skill within each skills cluster connects. So if I were to be coaching somebody on this, I would go to their skills list and say, okay, how specifically would you use these skills with this module?
I do understand that, but I guess I was thinking that this was more for us to teach every single thing on this list versus this being a planning tool for me. Maybe that's where the disconnect is for Beth and I. Is this something like, when I look at this skills list, I'm thinking that these are all the skills that I'm going to need to teach my students versus Norris, what you just said, I'm thinking, because I have taken Project Chris, I think that's a completely different mindset for me to say, okay, well, how do I need to prepare for the task in order to teach? And I can see where that even could get a little, for lack of better words, muddy. Because I should be going through all of this in the planning, but at the same time, like in the reading process, I could see me strategically or explicitly teaching the ability to identify and select relevant features and pictures that relate to important character information.
But why isn't that listed? Why isn't that listed?
It is listed. It's listed underneath the reading process, but like when I back up to the preparing for the task, I don't know if I was going to narrow this down, that I would really be putting in the task engagement portion where it says the ability to connect the task and new content to existing knowledge.
Yeah. So let me respond a little bit. I think that what you're keying into is really important conversation. Is it always necessary to explicitly teach task engagement and connecting to prior knowledge? Not necessarily. We don't see that every single time. Task analysis is kind of a must-have for us, right? They always need to have an opportunity to break down what they're being asked to do. Sometimes people include task engagement, sometimes they don't. And I think it would be less, in this case, about teaching the skill of task engagement as it is about making sure that you have a place in your ladder where you create an opportunity for students to do that, right? Where they have an opportunity to think about, what do I already know about world religions? Or what have I heard about this particular place in the world? And just kind of create a little bit of a schema to attach the rest of their learning to in the module. So I do agree with you that task engagement in particular is kind of a quirky skill, and it kind of raises the question of, is this really a skill? But it can be an important moment in the ladder, again, not necessarily to do a skills-driven lesson, but to create some kind of opportunity for students to do that thinking work that's called out in the definition of ability to connect to prior knowledge and experience. Does that make sense?
And then oh, sorry.
Go Beth.
From these skills, is that where my mini tasks come from?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's where we're going to go in this sequence together, is in looking at, once you've identified the skills, then you're going to be attaching one or more mini tasks to each skill to teach the skill, create the opportunity to engage, and so on.
So I might not attach a mini task to the preparing for the task.
Yes, that's what would be my question.
Okay.
You would definitely attach a mini task. So for any skill in your ladder, you would have a mini task, but it could be, and Tabitha just made a really great point in the chat, it could be a 5-minute engagement, KWL, something like that. It doesn't have to be kind of a prolonged lesson if it's not one of those more substantive literacy skills that you're doing at that moment.
Right. So I just want to make sure that I'm still under the same page, because as we just got back our feedback, I want to make sure that as we create the next round, and we're going to go through this process again, that I feel like sometimes with this design process, it depends on who's creating it and as what they feel is an enduring skill or what would be important. So that being said, I guess my question is, yes, we would always prepare for the task, but we don't need to list it in the skills section if we don't feel like we want to assess that through a mini task. That, I guess, would be the clarification there.
It should be there if you want to provide any instructional time around it within the module. We talk a lot about how mini tasks function as formative assessment, so I really appreciate the way you're keying into that idea of, including what I want to assess. But there are also, some important moments that just need to happen in the instruction along the way, where you might be more doing open discussion or connecting to prior knowledge, and you're not necessarily assessing in that moment, but it's an important part of the thinking that needs to take place to lead up to the task.
So for summarizing all of this, can I be safe to say that I hear you saying that as we move forward in creating our skills list, that we need to make sure that we have at least one skill from each skill cluster included in our module?
Yes, that is correct. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Very clear. Absolutely.
Can I chime in on that task engagement in particular? To your point, Nicole, about that, I mean, I've seen a teacher take a task engagement mini task, and they were really thinking about it, just in a hook exercise. Almost like we've got this new meaty task that we're about to embark on, and it's going to take, a week and a half, 2 weeks, so whatever they were working on. And they used it more as like a hook exercise in a DBQ or whatever, where they were using it. The mini task was less about an actual them teaching a skill, and it was more about hooking and getting the kids pumped up about that particular task, kind of hooking them thematically or whatever it was. And I actually kind of liked this one in that it appeared they were calling it out more as a skill set they were trying to teach as an enduring skill. So anytime we tackle a new meaty task, part of what we need to do is hook into what we already know. So it looked like this teacher, clearly they must have been thinking, well, I haven't really done that yet, so I want to teach that explicitly, and maybe in further instruction or in the next module down the road, the task engagement is like what Tabitha said and what you guys have pointed out, a really short exercise, quick. It's just sort of that natural, like, here's something new. What do we know about this already? Okay, move on. But maybe this time the teacher really wanted to call out that as a skill and something that could be repeatable with other tasks down the road. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in this case that thinking of task engagement and connecting to prior knowledge, it's almost more like a habit of mind than a skill. And it's included here because it is an important part of getting ready to grapple with new content, especially if it is something kind of meaty like this. So that's why the task engagement skill is there. That's why it's so common. Again, it's not in every single module, but there is always something in that preparing for the task moment to make sure that kids have an opportunity just to know what's being put in front of them. What are we about to do? Let's break down the prompt. Let's look at the rubric together and just know what those end expectations are, so that the backwards planning doesn't just live in our heads, but they know what they're working towards over the course of the module. The other thing I would say about this example in particular is I think that the other example of Grandpa's Corner Store is a much better example of the skills being custom and clearly representing, you know, comparison, inference from illustration, those specific elements of the task. So if you're thinking about what's the right level for me to customize, I would take that as your strong example. This example is included here just to give you a model of kind of a different structure where they have kind of repeated skills, where they have one cycle of vocabulary and reading and then another cycle within the reading process. So we're just trying to give you kind of a range of examples of that level of customization, different ways that you can structure the sequencing of skills to support that work. But definitely if you're living in that territory of like, how do I strike the balance of customizing skills? I think that Grandpa's Corner Store is a very strong example because they didn't build it out into a super long thing. It's not that much longer than the default skills list. They just made some edits to make those key skills in the reading process really clearly connect to the focus standards. We have a few more minutes, so let's hear from some other folks. What did you notice or experience in this? And I appreciate that, Beth and Jen, that you also took this back to your own learning in building a skills list, because that's key foundation for also thinking about then how to do this work with others. So I invite really any and all reflections, either about your own learning around skills here or around how you might use this kind of activity with others.
Nicole, I don't mean to be difficult. I really don't. But I'm a perfectionist and I don't want to submit something and then find out later the reason why. And so I'm going to go back to the Learn tab, and under the IC2 session 5, that card that you had us read, it says, you want the skills, I'm reading straight from the tab, you want the skills you identify on your final skills list to be the ones you plan on teaching and assessing as your students progress through the module. So yes, I believe in a hook activity and having the kids dissect the prompt, but I don't know that I would, so I'm not saying I wouldn't do it. I'm just saying I don't know that I would include it in my skills because I don't assess a KWL chart. I don't assess a, and maybe I'm wrong, I want feedback on that. Like I don't see it when I'm trying to build background knowledge. That's not something I normally would hold the kids accountable in a assessment, whether it be formal, you know, informal assessment or not. So I'm still grappling with that.
I hear you. I totally hear you. And I think that this is a little bit, kind of like an edge case, right? The task engagement question is pretty unique in terms of the rest of the skills list. I think it's pretty easy to see how you would assess almost all of the other stages of reading process and writing process, and in some cases maybe even transition, although that's another moment where you might pull back from the assessment idea and have it be more about discussion and just grappling with ideas. But that's why if you do look to the curriculum alignment rubric that's used to review these, when you see the section around scoring guides, there's a lot of language of sort of like most many tasks include scoring guides that, you know, allow you to gauge proficiency, because we acknowledge that there are usually a few moments in each module where there's something that's instructionally important, but you're not assessing because it really is more that opportunity to connect, build, discuss, grapple, and you're not assessing at that particular moment. So it's definitely part of the review process and the review tool to acknowledge that there are going to be moments in the ladder that aren't as directly formative assessment as most of those reading and writing process mini tasks probably should be. Any other thoughts, questions? Norris, I think you're trying to talk, but you're muted.
Susan posted a really good thought on the chat that she said that she felt the same way at first, but now believes that the connection to the task is key to vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, interest, especially complex text.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm surprised nobody said anything. I don't want to say too much, but I really liked seeing an example of a pre-assessment, because that's something that we often talk about in our district. How do we, if we're LDCs about a taught task, how do we make sure that we're actually differentiating and not either slowing kids down or not giving enough scaffolding support. So I really liked how that writer wove in a pre-assessment into this and kind of can customize the rest and what's needed and how long based on how they do. So I thought that was a neat example. I haven't seen that a lot in some of the modules I've looked at.
I want to say that I agree. Like, this part is hard. It's not easy. None of this is easy. So even David and I were looking at some modules today, and I mean, it's challenging. And so I really like the guiding steps and the questions, because that kind of helps me to maybe do it myself and then later on be able to teach somebody. Because it's definitely, I mean, there are some things I'm still grappling with and trying to wrap my mind around, but I like this process.
For sure. Thanks, Norris. And it is tricky, right? And we only have time each week to do little bits and pieces of what's in the coursework to support your thinking around that. So I do just want to encourage you, and this is not a shameless plug, I really do mean it, to take advantage of the time in between sessions to dig back into the course content and, in some cases, maybe look back to the previous instructional cycle and get some of these thoughts into that asynchronous discussion so we can continue wrestling with them. Because this in particular is something that educators do, but we don't always call out or do it explicitly and intentionally, right? When we do backwards planning, we are thinking about skills, but getting to the level of detail where we name them and define them and then attach specific lessons to those is at a level of granularity that honestly, often we just don't have time for, but also it takes a lot of cognitive space and a lot of cognitive energy. And it's not about getting it right. It's just about being able to see that connection between what are the key kind of most central demands of the task and the focus standards, and can we see that those are being addressed through the instructional ladder and through the skills that are identified. So hopefully this has prompted thinking for you that will be useful as you move forward in your own work. For next week, you are going to actually continue on into session 6 of this instructional cycle. I'm going to share my screen again just really briefly to show you that you're going to take a little bit of time to read through what's there in session 6, but primarily your focus for this week is the action item of completing your own skills list, at least as a first draft, because you're going to continue to be able to refine that over the course of deep dive. And then what we are going to do is also, this is going to be a little bit different from blended foundations, offer you opportunities to do a one-on-one look at your module before you submit it to national peer review, to give you a little bit more confidence and check any specific questions that you have. So this is, before next week, you're going to be completing that first draft of the skills list, but we're going to continue to be able to refine it over our sessions together and in a one-on-one workshop before you submit that to national peer review. So we want to make sure that you really feel supported in that work. As usual, you'll also be posting to the asynchronous discussion and teaching channel. And that'll just be another opportunity to reflect on the work we did tonight, the work you're doing in your own module, and how you can carry that through in your work with other teachers as well. Megan has just posted the link to our teaching channel group. We haven't gotten to spend much time in there since we just started with session 1, and then everybody was kind of distracted between that session and tonight. But we're just going to go ahead and move forward to this week's discussion. And before we go tonight, I want to invite just one more opportunity in the chat to post a final word or phrase to let us know what you're thinking about as you move forward into your work with skills list. So that'll be your ticket out the door for tonight, to post a word or phrase in the chat that gives us a little clue about what you're thinking after tonight's session moving forward.